sign that we are live, Teresa. So I think I'm just going to see here on LinkedIn that this is going live and that we are actually being heard and seen. Okay, LinkedIn's not showing it to me, so I'm just going to trust that Restream's has got us covered and that this is streaming. So welcome everyone. This is going out live, so we won't know if you've joined us live. I will mention this during our conversation, that we will only know that you're here if you say hi in the comments, so that we can, respond to a question or a comment in that way. Otherwise, if you are watching this on replay, you're also welcome to comment, because actually we can see the comments retrospectively as well. So I just thought I'd mention that. But welcome to the conversation between me and my lovely friend and colleague, Teresa Behan. And we are here to talk about what we titled Beyond People Pleasing, and when being nice costs you your health, your authority and your authenticity. And really what we want to discuss is what is known in the polyvagal theory and nervous system work, fawn response. And we want to I just had a little Restream pop up here, which is has distracted me. So we are here to talk about this response, and we'll lay out why we think it's really important to talk about this. But we want to talk about it specifically in relation to how it impacts leadership, how it impacts relationships, boundaries, and health. I am Katarina Hunter. I will briefly introduce myself, and then Teresa, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself. But before I do that, just very briefly to say that Teresa and I got together on her podcast recently. In fact, just about a month ago, 6th of October, the podcast went live, the Sensitive Professionals podcast, where we talked about being highly sensitive, being a highly sensitive person, which, and at the end of the conversation, we kind of did a little debrief and realized that what's also really needed and what's linked with high sensitivity is fawning, is the fourth trauma or nervous system stress response that is very little talked about. The fight or flight is much more out there, that there is a lot more conversation about it. I'm not sure that it's fully understood either. However, it is much more known. We are also getting to know the freeze response a little bit more. I talk a lot about functional freeze in my work. But fawning is still a little bit of a unknown. And for some reason, we still have 3 nervous system stress response rather than 4. And so we thought we'd get together and have a somewhat structured dialogue and conversation about the impact of what fawning is, why it's really important for us to be aware of it, where it comes from, and how it impacts health, well-being, as well as leadership and career. And so I am coming into this from the angle of health and well-being. I help women who overfunction to the point of dysregulation, chronic stress, chronic fatigue, exhaustion, chronic illness. And I help them to really come back to themselves, which then leads to and supports health regeneration. It supports vitality. It supports balance in the body. And I've worked very hard over the past 7-8 years that I've been doing this work to really understand the nervous system impact, as well as how to work with a nervous system, because I know that within our wellness, fitness, health, well-being industries, unfortunately, a lot of the approaches can be very shaming and do not necessarily work with the person in front of them. There is a lot of this external fixing type approach, and we either fail to do what we are being told to do. We feel that we don't have enough willpower, or we don't have enough discipline. And I've seen the damage and harm that does to a lot of people. And so I work with health with the trauma-informed approach and working with the nervous system. So we get to the root of things rather than just kind of superficial solutions. So yeah, so Teresa, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself. If I left anything out in kind of like laying it out, and also like, why is this important to you? When I heard you talk to me about it, I was like, wow, yes, I can see why you're so passionate about it. So I'll just hand over to you.
Yeah, no, definitely. And thank you so much for suggesting that we have this conversation as a follow-on. So yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I am Teresa Behan. I'm actually in a little bit of a professional transition. So I think the best way to introduce myself right now is to say that I am an operational and change leader. I'm also a facilitator, and I would call myself a sensitivity advocate. Katerina mentioned it already that she joined me on my podcast. So I host the Sensitive Professionals podcast. And the work that I do really centers around the belief that sensitivity is what I call an edge. And I believe that that edge particularly can show up in work and leadership. So I'm super interested in what it looks like to lean into that edge rather than masking it or trying to work around it somehow. And that's really why I'm looking forward to this conversation today, because I think for so many thoughtful professionals, I think fawning can start to show up more and more over time. And much like what you said, Katerina, I don't think we talk about it enough. And I do also think that there are a lot of misconceptions around it, which I know that we're going to be digging into and hopefully dispelling some of that today as well.
Yeah, no, great. And, I love that you are, that you've got the angle, which is why I love collaborating with you, because I am really interested in how this shows up in a workplace environment and in our interpersonal relationships and in leadership, both self-leadership and leadership of others. And how actually I'm really excited about just understanding this and people knowing how important it is to go on a healing journey out of this pattern, how it can really transform lives and health, and how we show up in our workplace and in our lives and in our relationships. So so shall we start with what fawning is and just describing it briefly? And so from where I'm sitting in terms of the, we'll talk about the impact on health and physiological impact in a moment, but just to say from my point of view, that fawn is really it is the most sophisticated survival response in our nervous system. Like the other stress responses, it is an organic response. So all behaviors that come with fawning, which we can describe as appease. In fact, fawn is also known as appease. People pleasing, that's the term that is widely thrown around out there on social media these days. Fitting in, and these kinds of behaviors are not personality character traits. It's an adaptation or maladaptation that we learn, that that the nervous system learns in order to survive. It is self-preservation response. And I think it's really important to say that, because it allows us to de-shame behaviors that are in fact really rewarded in our society and in our culture. So I love that we are going to shed some light on this as well. And just, before I hand over to you, Teresa, for your kind of definition and understanding, I just want to mention that why fawn is really complex is because, physiologically speaking, it is a behavior or a response that looks like connection, authentic connection. So it's a survival, but it co-opts the social engagement state in our nervous system, but it mimics authentic connection. The authenticity is missing. That piece is not there. Because essentially fawning, when the system goes into fawning because fight, flight, or freeze weren't available, all those things, by the way, stay suppressed underneath it. This is why it's so complex. So there's a lot of emotional suppression going on and a lot of activation underneath. And yeah, I've lost that little a trail of thought that I had that I wanted to finish this thought with. But yeah, so basically there's a lot of activation underneath that. There's co-opted connection that looks like authenticity, but the authenticity is actually missing, which is our biological need. So that's I think how I would define fawning. And a lot of people who fawn struggle with boundaries, struggle with self-expression, struggle with anger, which is one of the key emotions here. And yeah, so I think I'll just hand over to you, Teresa.
Yeah, I think just echoing some of the things that you you have already mentioned. So for me, the fawn response, it obviously sits alongside what I'd say are some of the more familiar. You mentioned survival response. I know that sometimes we call them stress or trauma responses. So just using all of that terminology. So we've heard of fight and flight, maybe more so freeze as well. And with fawn, it's often, I think, described as the response where we try to appease a perceived threat. So perhaps rather than pushing back or running away, we become especially helpful, agreeable, or compliant, and we want to smooth things over. And we'll scan for what others need, and we want to try and meet those needs, often at the expense of our own needs. And I think what's important to call out here is that isn't conscious. So it's not just about being nice in the everyday sense. It's actually what the nervous system has learned to do in order to feel safe.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yes, that's that nicely kind of wraps up the definition of fawning. And I think because we're both in the helping profession, I think it is important to mention that, and to de-shame it as well, that actually a lot of people who are in the helping professions of all kinds are, very high skilled people pleasers and appeasers, because we are highly attuned, we are highly sensitive people. So, because with this response actually comes a lot of very helpful social and relational skills. Right. So it's not that it's all bad, and we don't want to throw everything out of the window and suddenly, and I really dislike when I see on social media this kind of rhetoric of, just really stop caring what other people think. I don't like that, because we need to have a sense of belonging, and we will do anything, even put ourselves at harm's risk, in order to belong. And fawning is that. It happens in order for us not to rupture, not to be rejected from a social group. So it has really deep roots, and yeah.
And I also think, I wondered if it would be helpful just to sort of talk a little bit about how it might develop and why it can become your go-to response a little bit. I think if we trace it back, I think it can often start early. And I know, Katerina, you and I have had this conversation about it, it almost starts as a seed and it builds up over time. So maybe we realize in our childhood at some point, or maybe in our first job, that when we are agreeable, when we keep things smooth, that's when things feel safe and steady. We start to realize that that's when we're accepted, that's when things stay calm. And so it naturally starts to become a default. And I think for women especially, I think this gets reinforced culturally, like that being accommodating is what makes us good or likable or easygoing. And they're all things that almost sound like compliments, right? But underneath that is a nervous system that doesn't believe it's safe to express our true self or our true thoughts and feelings, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is why working with this stress response requires, in addition to nervous system regulation, it actually requires relational healing. So that there is enough of ventral vagal connection coming online, and that, as we know, that can only happen through co-regulation. It doesn't happen in isolation, just doing nervous system or vagus nerve exercises, for example. Those can be really helpful in building capacity for doing the healing work. So, they go hand in hand. But it is really important. And I didn't mention that I am an integrative health coach and a somatic therapist, because I see how important it is to be able to work with a person in front of me, not just by telling them what they should be doing, but by really engaging relationally with with the behaviors and patterns of the fawn. So, just very briefly to go back to what you said, where it's rooted in, it is rooted in a trauma, but not the trauma that we believe to be the big T traumas. So it's not the accidents, the violence, the war that people experience as a traumatic experience. This kind of behavior develops in relation to, and this can be unintentional from our parents and caregivers, right? But it develops in response to not having our emotional needs met or physical needs met in childhood when we are very little. So this is pre-verbal, this is pre-cognitive, and the nervous system. We learned that if we, as you already described, that if we just do what we are praised for or what we are approved for, that then we are safe. But as you said, what that does, it actually suppresses, on perhaps never even develops, the authentic emotional response in the body. In the child's case, it can be at the age of 2, for instance. We are I'm not a child psychologist, but I am very interested in this, how we develop into adults with trauma responses in our systems. But at the age of 2, for instance, it's part of a normal developmental process that the child starts to go no to everything. And that is the child's way to really test out their boundaries and test out their own power against the adult who is almighty and very powerful. And in our culture, we don't necessarily allow that, right? Because culturally, we don't have very healthy relationship with emotion of anger and self-expression to go with that, or self-assertion. We are very uncomfortable about it. And so, it is deeply suppressed. And it's a very necessary emotion for mental, emotional, physical, spiritual health and well-being. Yeah,
absolutely.
So I don't know if you had anything else to add here, Teresa, but if not, I was wondering whether we could move into talking a little bit about, from your kind of angle, the impact of people-pleasing and fawning on careers and workplace relationships, and our growth and personal development.
Yeah, absolutely. So, where I thought I might start with this is a little bit of an overview of how it might show up at work. Because I'm also aware that people tuning in, they might have some awareness already, or it's something that they're completely new to. And that's all okay. But from a work perspective, I think it can look a lot like being that go-to person. So the safe
Hmm.
pair of hands. Again, I'm using a lot of the same words because I just want to reinforce that that's probably the kind of words that you might hear people refer to you as. And we talked about how this can become coupled with your personality. And so these can all become, you know, traits or characteristics that we associate with our identity. So you might hear that you're agreeable, reliable, maybe even known for keeping things steady.
Hmm.
You possibly volunteer for a lot of things, or what I call being voluntold. So people telling you that you're going to do something because they know you're going to say yes. You always say yes. So I think boundaries often aren't clear or visible. You're probably overfunctioning to avoid disappointing others, but no one might realize it as a boundary issue. So, and especially if
Yeah,
you're good at masking it. So you
yeah,
probably come across as calm and really capable, almost like
yeah,
that kind of swan analogy. Everything looks pristine up top, but underneath things are, you're not feeling that way. So you're paddling like mad to hold it all together. I think it can also show up in avoiding challenge and conflict. So you might defer to the majority. You might hesitate to speak up, especially if challenging the status quo at work, rocking the boat doesn't feel safe. And I think over time, this pattern gets rewarded, which then also makes it harder to spot.
yeah, yeah. No, really well described. I've just seen a comment come through, so I'm just going to read that because I think it might be in relation to what you were saying. So sometimes, and I can't see the name of the person who shared it. Just says LinkedIn user, so forgive me if I'm not addressing you personally, but thank you for commenting. So sometimes we are too afraid to say no because we always try to be good, and if we say no, we are afraid of adding to the problem. So we are lazy to always say yes. Yeah, saying no and being afraid of or terrified of conflict, as you said, Teresa, is one of those responses. And again, it's really important to understand, and it's important to reiterate as well that this is not a personality issue. It's not that you are lazy to always say no, or lazy to always say yes. It is a survival pattern which requires awareness, bringing awareness to it, and not just on the mindset level. I think here it's we can kind of go and say why the body-based approach and to boundary setting is fundamental, because this isn't just a mindset thing. Again, we see a lot of kind of advice that you can just learn to say things in a certain way. It's not that learning how to communicate isn't important. That's not what I'm saying. But fawning with the behaviors that we've described stem from a nervous system state. They come from the body, and they have to be addressed at the body level. Because when we start to set clearer boundaries, actually it can bring up a lot of discomfort in the system and a lot of resistance in the system. Because when you've never said no when you wanted to say, or the other way around, when when you've not said no and always said yes, it's not just the system just doesn't have capacity for, because of that being terrified of conflict, or being afraid of not being loved, essentially, or not belong to the group. So it has to be felt, sensation led. I would also mention here that when this is actually really good news, I think, for a lot of people who struggle with fawning, because there can be a lot of confusion emotionally underneath that, and we don't really know how we feel. And and there is so much suppression emotionally in the body that it can feel really challenging and difficult to go and talk about all these things, and try and heal it in that way. But reconnecting to the body just allows a non-story, very gentle way to come back to connection with these things. So actually, it can open doors for healing in ways that just doing mindset work or starting with mindset work just will not allow. So
yeah. And I know that you were interested in sort of the cost to leadership, right? And the
yes,
kind of leadership presence and authority. And I was thinking, before we even get to the cost of that, I think there is a personal cost. I'm not going to tread into your expertise around body, but what I wanted to call out is that there is a real cost to us as humans. So when you're constantly saying yes, constantly smoothing things over, I think it really starts to chip away at your energy. And, you know, you talked about feelings coming up. I think you can start to feel resentful, disillusioned, angry. And you might find yourself saying one thing or agreeing to something, and then maybe saying to someone else, whether in work or outside of work, that actually you wish you hadn't said that or agreed to that. And I think that kind of dissonance builds up, and that then starts to create guilt and frustration, and that growing sense that you're not really being yourself and you're not really sure how to stop it either.
yeah, yes, yeah, really well said. It is it's like all, you know, these social skills and relational skills that we mentioned that are really beneficial, that can be beneficial from the fawn response, kind of become codependent with overgiving, and, you know, what we call self-sabotage, and feeling resentful, and feeling exhausted underneath all that, kind of, you know, being available for everyone and everything. So yes, it is important to be aware of that, for sure. We have another comment. Yeah, that's saying no will have bad results. Yes, and it is essentially, this is a conversation. I just see the word authenticity there. This is a conversation about this conflict. I think it was Gabor Mate who describes it as this tragic conflict in human beings between belonging and authenticity. So really, fawning is an attempt to belong, and but there is this conflict with, we also need to be ourselves, and having ourselves expressed authentically. So it is about really finding ways and options to give our nervous system options for different ways to respond. It's not that, you know, being agreeable is always bad, but when does it come at the cost of your own needs? When does it come at the cost of your own self-expression of what you want, and not just what others want? And I know from, you know, personally, this is a pattern that I've lived with for all my life, really. And I'm still seeing, and I've done a lot of work on it, and I'm still seeing when it shows up in ways where, you know, I do really want to make sure that everyone has everything that they need and everyone knows what we are doing, and, you know, just kind of fixing problems before they even arise. And I do much less of that now, but when I look back, it is exhausting, and underneath all that is just stress being turned on and activated in your body constantly, and we are not really built for that. So yeah.
Do you want me to talk a little bit about the cost to leadership presence and authority?
Yeah, go on.
So I think, like, when you do find yourself fawning at work, I think it can become harder to show up with that strong sense of self. You know, you're managing perception. I think you're keeping the peace. And, you know, we learn to scan, and we're reading the room constantly. but not necessarily being seen for who you actually are. And I think that can start to dilute your leadership presence. So if you're always flexing to accommodate, I think it's hard for people to know what you actually stand for. And it's also hard for you to feel rooted in your own authority. And I think people may trust your competence, but they don't then necessarily feel your leadership. And I think that gap does matter, especially I think when you're trying to step into bigger or more visible roles. You know, I think with fawning, it does often create this kind of what I call like a quiet fog in relationships and team dynamics. And I think you might struggle then to make decisions without perhaps canvassing lots of opinions first, or delaying action because you're just trying to keep everyone happy. And people may experience you as easygoing or accommodating, but if that's not how you actually really feel, over time, that is going to erode trust, not just with the people around you, but also with their, you know, your own relationship with you. So I think because people can't be sure where you stand or whether your yes then actually means yes, I think that starts to create confusion. Even if no one's naming it, I think that can become this energy that sits there. And I think that then makes it hard to build clear and confident relationships when you're almost, it's, you know, that stability is a performance, but inside you're feeling really stretched and perhaps starting to feel really ambivalent about everything.
Yeah, no, I love that you mentioned that sort of, you didn't use the word atmosphere, but that's what I sense. It's like it's in the atmosphere, in the team and in the workplace. And that can be psychologically quite difficult to be in that kind of environment when you don't know where you stand, you don't know what others feel, you can't quite express, perhaps others aren't expressing themselves either. So yeah, I love this description of the fog, where and it isn't healthy to be in those kinds of environments. So yeah. So I love how you described that. And in terms of, you know, it impacts also the career progression, right? Or job satisfaction. It can be quite complex, I imagine, why you want change, but you don't really know what do you want, what that looks like. It's perhaps difficult to take certain risks, because we do need to take risks when we want to bring about change in our professional lives. Well, in fact, in everything in life, but specifically in our careers. So, and that can then reinforce this feeling of disconnection and loneliness, perhaps, as well, which has nothing to do with all the accomplishments that we have. And it can come with a lot of shame as well, I think. And fawn and shame are very deeply connected. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think someone else has added a comment there as well.
Yes. So was there, I'll take a look at this comment in a moment. Was there anything else that you wanted to add to the impact of career leadership? You've described it really, really well. I love your examples as well, but just in, if you had anything else to add.
Not right now. I know, I'm keen to ask you some questions about health and well-being impact. And then I know that we'll probably, because those two are going to come together. So I'd love to then look at, and I'm very happy to also share, because there's no shade here. I have my own experience, and I'm very happy to share with people what this has looked like for me, and what has happened over time as well. So
great.
So do you want me to, would you like to go into health and well-being, or do you want to have a look at the comment first?
Shall we look at the comment very quickly? So if there is, So I think this is a very specific a situation. I'm being very honest with you. I'm not sure my brain can quite process it right now. So would it be okay if we come back to this comment afterwards and we can just respond on LinkedIn or in a personal DM more specifically to this? Because I think it's asking for a response to a specific situation, which I'm not quite sure we're really well positioned to do right now. So it might take a little bit of time to do that. Would that be okay?
Yeah. I think there's a follow-up comment there as well. But I echo what you're saying, Catherine. I'd love to dig into it, but it might be better to do that separately.
Yeah, so we'll do that. We'll do that after.
Okay.
Hopefully the person can hear us. So yeah.
Yeah. So health and well-being and tapping into your area of expertise. I wanted to ask you about this idea of the body keeping score with this idea of fawning, chronic people pleasing, and if you could share a little bit more about that term and what that means for you in relation to this.
Yeah. So what we also often forget is how the body is one unified organism. It's not that the mind is separate from our mental and physical and emotional health. It's all one. And fawning response really is a great example of that, where it's it works both ways. So the body keeps the score of the dysregulated nervous system that sits underneath the fawn response. And at the same time, the fawn response as a nervous system state is the root cause of those behaviors and the thought patterns associated with fawning. And the body keeps the score because, as I mentioned at the start, the fawn is very complex physiologically as well, because underneath the appease behavior is a nervous system that's constantly activated. And what that means is it is constantly on fight or flight and freeze response. Now, our body physiologically isn't built for chronic stress. Stress is short-term stress is very beneficial for us. So it's not that stress in itself is bad. Short-term stress helps to help us focus. It improves cognition. It improves memory. It even improves our immune system, because cortisol, short-term cortisol in our bloodstream, is actually a protective stress hormone, and it boosts our immune system. However, it's a completely different story when that stress response is just constantly, permanently on and is activated. And it can be activated even when we are disconnected or dissociated from our body. This is the thing with overfunctioning, which is very much linked with fawning, is that we can often just be numbed out from even pain and chronic health issues until we come to the point where the body is really almost like screaming at us with chronic issue. That's not to say, again, de-shaming. We don't cause our chronic health issue. It's not that you're doing something wrong to have a certain diagnosis. But it just helps to understand that the body is doing its own thing by being dysregulated, and it also has a way to regulate and heal. Our body has a self-healing mechanism, which can be turned on when we do the emotional and the nervous system work. So we know we are not completely powerless in the face of chronic illness either. And But so a lot of there can be a host of different health issues as a result of chronic stress. Because chronic stress activates inflammation, really like systemic inflammation in the body, and inflammation is the root of all chronic health issues, as we now know. It leads to cardiovascular issues, autoimmune conditions, even some forms of cancer. And so, it is important that we have the education about this. And so, yes, is this making sense as I'm describing? The link, really what I'm trying to draw here is the link between the suppressed emotion and the dysregulated nervous system and chronic stress just constantly churning away in the background. Never having a pause or rest to just allow the body to go into what we call the rest and digest state, so that the digestive system can process the food, so that it can absorb the nutrition that you're eating, whether it's food or supplementation, and the brain can function properly. If the nervous system is constantly activated, you have eaten away and depleted all your resources, and you've not had a chance to replenish, it is going to lead to a chronic health issue, and the body keeps the score through the chronic illness. Now, pathologizing those illnesses isn't helpful, because identifying ourselves with chronic illness also keeps the nervous system in activation. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I do think it can be really helpful to understand some of that. So I'm a firm believer that educating ourselves about this is like one of the steps we can take to better, that acceptance. We would talk about we're not judging here. It's not about shame. It's, even though that might come up, but it's what we're really trying to say is these are all steps to just understand ourselves a little bit better. And what was coming up for me as you were talking through that is, if we're dysregulated underneath that fawn response, so not only do we have the fawn response being the default, underneath we have this cocktail of fight, flight, freeze happening. We're constantly, it's normal for our nervous system to be scanning, right? Yeah. And so if we're constantly scanning, for me, there's almost this element of not just even perceiving threats that might not be there, or or perceiving, responding to things that we are then picking up through the scanning. With fawn, I also think there's an element of almost anticipating. So it's like a pre-scan, it's like, yes, I know I'm going to probably pick
You're in that alert mode, alertness, which is like the first or organic response to threat that occurs before the fight or flight. So yeah, I think that's what you're saying. Yeah. 100%. And of course, chronic stress over time, and chronic stress is, and this might be surprising to a lot of people, but chronic stress begins, so our systems more or less are built to hold stress for up to 2 hours at any given time. So think about this. We are living in a society and culture where we are permanently on. So, it's not surprising that we are feeling fatigued and, have digestive health issues and depression and anxiety, and autoimmune conditions in particular are very interesting here because, and I should mention that because autoimmunity is particularly linked with suppressed anger. So women actually are, they form 80% of all autoimmune conditions, which is a very interesting statistic. Actually, majority of my clients are women, and they have autoimmune condition of some kind. And working with building capacity and reconnecting with your own self-assertion, healthy anger, self-expression leads to just those antibodies settling down and actual remission of autoimmunity, which just shows so beautifully how our emotional health is interconnected with our physical health. In women, it is just, this overfunctioning and overgiving, and the being permanently informed response just leads to that chronic stress being constantly on underneath all that. Yeah. So yeah, I'm just trying to think whether that's probably what I wanted to mention and to draw our attention, unless there is another question, Teresa, that you have about health and well-being.
I think when we start to talk about that interconnection, then I know we wanted to look at kind of career leadership and health and where those patterns meet. So that might be, some more stuff might come out there as well, certainly from our own experiences, I'm sure.
Yes, yeah, great. Well, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's kind of really stood out for me, and certainly in my experience, and in those, like in the coaching work I have done previously, is that that fawning doesn't just show up at work. It shows up often in all facets of our life, and I do think it's something that can chip away at your sense of self. And so I think we've talked a bit about the cost to us as humans, the cost to leadership presence and things like decision making. I think underneath that is often this deeper cost to the relationship that we have with ourselves. Because if we're constantly choosing others over ourselves, even in subtle ways, I think the inner relationship starts to erode. And I think over time that's something we can mask, not to ourselves, and I think eventually others. And I think that loss of self-connection starts to make it harder to lead clearly. I think it's harder to set and hold boundaries. I think it becomes harder to then even know what we need. I think you touched on that earlier as well, Katerina. And I think at the same time, it takes a toll on our health. And I think for me, it was slowly and then all at once. So, chronic appeasement is draining. So you might not notice it at first. You're still performing, you're still showing up, you're still doing the job, but your capacity starts to shrink. I think your vitality starts leaking. And because you've learned to override your system, you might not even realize how much it's costing you. So in my own experience, that sort of slow depletion really did build up over time. So I didn't connect those dots at first. I just felt tired.
Yeah.
And then I felt even more tired. And then I'd take some time off. And then I'd come back still feeling flat. And then eventually, like, the wheels properly came off. I didn't have the energy to function, never mind to lead. And that was me off. I'd have to, I'd get signed off, and it led to burnout. And I think because we're so used to keeping things looking fine on the surface, it can take a long time before we actually even allow ourselves to name it. And certainly for me, there's a lot of guilt, a lot of second guessing, a lot of trying to manage it in ways that probably aren't, certainly didn't work for me. A lot of caffeine, a lot of pushing through, just finding ways to keep going. But it becomes a cycle, that kind of performing, depleting, getting unwell, recovering just enough, performing again, but you're slowly performing here, and it starts to really feel like that's just how it is. And I think that's, I think again, that's why it's so important that we are talking about this. I think not to scare anyone, but just to start naming that pattern, because it can be interrupted. But only if we start recognizing that we are performing without authenticity, without self-connection, and that is not sustainable, and it will eventually come at a cost.
Yeah, really, really beautifully said. And I think what I want to mention here, in that interconnection, is that it's also really important to know that we're not sort of just islands, that we don't get we don't develop these patterns by ourselves, and also we can't heal them by ourselves. And the systems that we are in, the culture, the structure, the system that we're functioning, whether it's in a workplace or in a wider culture, has an impact on us and shapes us. So, don't think that this is somehow you being broken, or that somehow you are failing at. I'm sort of speaking to to people who are listening. That there is something wrong with you. It is really important to know that there is this link between the systems we are in and our own health and well-being. And someone's just commented asking, how do you manage work-related stress or high-pressure situations in your career? And this is a really great question, actually, at this point, to mention from my perspective, that I think manage stress is when we have trauma and dysregulation in the nervous system isn't going to work. I am not saying don't manage your stress, but I'm saying it will always just be very superficial, because often managing stress tends to be about activities that you do, and it's not necessarily leading you or guiding you back to your own body, back to your own experience, and back to your own connection to, well, what do you need? What do you want? What do you desire? How do you even experience stress in your system? How do you know that you are stressed? And how, what does your nervous system do with certain situations that you are in or circumstances that you are in? Because stress is not the situation. The stress is what happens in the body in response to the situation or the circumstances. So I know that may not be something that you wanted to hear, right? Because so often we just want, well, just do this and then you will, your stress will be managed. I'm not going to say that, because I don't want to add to this false kind of idea that you can resolve the stress by doing 1, 2, 3 steps to that. That's not to say that there aren't tools. Of course, this work has a lot of tools, really wonderful tools, but it's not about what you're doing. It's about what you're noticing, and the conditions within which you are doing them, both relationally, and so the relationship with yourself and the relationship with the person that's helping you, whether it's a coach or a therapist or a group, whichever path one takes. So I hope that was making sense.
Would it be okay if I jumped in
on
this as well?
Of course, absolutely.
Because I was thinking, I think this actually ties a little bit also to what I wanted to talk about around, what changes when you start to recognize it. And so for me, what weaves into this, I've recognized phoning in myself. I've also experienced work-related stress, high-pressure environments, navigated those in a way that's led to burnout, and in a way that I did really well. My sensitivity was also woven through that, and so there's a bigger piece that we don't have time to go into here today. But that certainly, but all of that, what that came down to was recognizing the pattern. And I think the first thing that changes when you recognize the patterns that you have is that you start to give yourself choice. And as soon as something moves into your awareness, I think you're no longer just running on that default. And that actually creates a little bit of space. And it might be like a tiny little bit of space at first, and you can learn to then create a bit more space.
Yes.
And I agree with you, Katerina. This is not a blueprint, because how I approached it might not be how, and I can't see the name of the user here who's asked, LinkedIn user who's asked this question, but what's going to work for Katerina is going to be different to what works for me and what works for you. But I think that, it doesn't mean that you have to act on it straight away, and you might not, but the awareness itself can be really empowering. And then I think that awareness also brings acceptance, and ideally a bit of compassion too, because when we start to look back and think, okay, how did I let this happen? Why didn't I see this earlier? That's, we're applying judgment, but you did what believed worked. And recognizing that now doesn't mean that you failed. It means that you're growing, because you're getting curious. And so for me, moving forward is really about getting curious. It's about learning what your own system needs and understanding your pattern. So instead of thinking, oh my goodness, I've said yes again, I'm so bad at this, you might start to ask yourself, like, okay, I just said yes again. What was going on for me there? I wonder why I felt like I didn't have another option. Yeah. And I think that shift from judgment to curiosity is really, really powerful. And it doesn't mean you'll never fawn again. It just means that you'll notice it sooner, and you will have more options in how you respond. And I think one of the hardest but most freeing things is developing the capacity to disappoint people and feel okay about that. That does take a lot of work. We talked about it before. If we've always said yes, all of a sudden saying no, we've had the door wide open, and all of a sudden we're shutting it, and we're controlling when we open that door. Because people will be disappointed sometimes, and that's just part of being human. And it doesn't mean that you've done something wrong.
Yeah.
And especially like for those of us who are sensitive. So I don't know if people tuning in are, but I'm just going to build that in. Or, if you feel the weight of other people's reactions, that can be tough. But I think there's something really transformative about being seen in your truth, even when it is uncomfortable. And I think that's when your presence, whether in a leadership capacity or not, starts to deepen. Your boundaries start to become much clearer. Maybe not always perfectly articulated. We talked about communication skills before. That takes time, but they become more visible and more consistent, and they strengthen over time. And your energy.
Oh, Teresa, we've lost your sound. You're back. We've lost your sound just for a moment.
Oh, sorry.
Just for those last few words, but you are, yes, you're back.
Oh gosh, I think my Bluetooth just decided to quit on me there. Can you still hear me?
Yes, you're back. And I think it was just the last few words.
Yeah, so I was just talking about energy. So I think your energy becomes something that you can then start to manage and protect, instead of something that you constantly give away.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, you mentioning curiosity as the first step, it's, so important to know that when we bring curiosity, that moves us out of the self-judgment and the self-shaming. It actually turns on our social engagement state of connection, because now, and what happens physiologically as well, is you are now beginning to build back the interoceptive sense of what is going on inside my body, which actually leads to the brain going, okay, well, all is well. And it regulates the system. So there's so much that happens in the body when we switch from being taken by that response and not being aware of it, to bringing that awareness and that little bit of curiosity initially, just enough, staying within your capacity to be able to be with it, but just enough to turn on the nervous system state that just helps us to be a little bit more hopeful and a little bit more present and here and now, because those practices are the way forward. And doing little bit at a time is what we need to do, because doing too much too soon leads to overwhelm, and that's the nervous system's not going to have capacity for that. So, and one, just to add to this from my sort of somatic perspective, it's remembering that it's about felt sensation and the body. So if we're talking about restoring boundaries, we can begin. Touch is a really beautiful way to come back to our body and to feel our physical boundary. I'm here. This is me. For example, just bringing connection through hands to the physical being, rather than kind of going on, learning affirmations and repeating affirmations of how to set boundaries. This can be really restorative. And it sounds very simple, but again, you're building new neural pathways in your brain and your nervous system, and you don't have to go into the story, so you don't have to think your way into it, but you can feel your way into what saying no really feels like, and being with that discomfort initially, because it is going to be uncomfortable, as you said. So, yeah, and we've got this really great question, Teresa. If you're okay, just for a couple of minutes to stay on. What role do leaders play in fostering a sense of interconnection and inclusion? I just think that's a really, really great question. Just very briefly, from my point of view, big role. Leaders are also humans, I would say, so they will have their own survival responses in their behaviors and in their bodies. So again, we have to have compassion for all of the humans that we are interacting with. But there is a lot of scope and space for managers and leaders becoming trauma informed and actually having the understanding of why it's so important to feel other people's emotional states, rather than because that's what builds trust, essentially. So I don't know if you wanted to. The answer is yes, a huge role. It's both. We are individually responsible for ourselves, and we are collectively responsible for others.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could do a LinkedIn Live just on that question.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so many questions that have been asked, and I just want to say I will go back to all of them properly.
Yeah, we will do that.
But on the leadership thing, yeah, I think, it's so important. It comes back to something that I've learned that I call meta skills, and so we do need to have an understanding and good relationship with ourselves as a leader, and that's where it starts. And if you don't have that, how can you have a good relationship with other people if you don't have a good relationship with yourself? Even if you pretend, like we can pretend only for so long, it's going to start to take a toll. And it's, people feel these things. I'm a sensitive person. If you tell me one thing, but I sense something else, like I'm gonna know that. And so I think it's really important that if you do have the privilege of having the official role of leader in any given environment, that you do the work to show up and to create the space for people to be who they are. I think that's also really, really important.
Yeah, great. I love that. This is such a rich conversation, and it's such a complex conversation as well, which frustrates me a little bit, because I'm like, there are so many more different angles that we can take to really bring on understanding about this. But perhaps we can. Well, we will definitely follow through with the comments and respond to the questions. I think, Teresa, a lot of those are sort of work related type questions, but there is one at the end which is asking about what to do when I feel drained and isolated, and how can I rebuild connection and replenish energy. So I'll come back to to you on that one from the health and well-being perspective and nervous system regulation. And so we have gone sort of 4 minutes over, 5 minutes over now. So I think, would you agree, we'll bring it to a close for the time being. And, you know, you never know, maybe we'll be back another time to have another conversation.
Well, let us know. I mean, actually, yeah, let us know.
That's a good point. Yeah,
whether you've joined us live or
yes,
you're watching on sort of catching up, because there's lots of stuff that I prepared that we haven't even been able to go into. Never mind all of the great questions that we've had. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Maybe people watching could let us know, and then we could respond spontaneously and do another live to address the question specifically. So with that said, it's Friday afternoon, so hopefully everyone is already feeling that the weekend is coming and that you have a really good one. Enjoy the autumn weather, and we will see you. We'll see you soon. Thanks for being here, everyone. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you.